And he plays such a significant part in setting the scene for Jesus that I really wanted to continue it. So I'll just begin with a bit of a recap about what I said at Sisters class. So Matthew 2 tells us that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king. So this is telling us that the days of Herod the king are the same as the days of Jesus. And they were dark days because Herod was the epitome of evil. So there's lots of Herods in the gospel, but only one called Herod the king. He was the first Herod and by far the most powerful. And he's the Herod of Matthew 2 who ordered the killing of the babies. This is a map of his kingdom, the pink one, and I've compared it to the map of the time of Saul and David, the blue one. So you can see that it's pretty similar in size. So Herod was king of all Israel. He was the only Herod who controlled the entire kingdom. And the Bible describes the land of Israel as the land of 7 nations, as we read, when God said to Joshua, when the Lord your God brings you into the land that you are entering to possess and drives out before you the Hittites, the Girgashites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, 7 nations larger and stronger than you, we need to understand that the land of Israel, henceforth in Bible symbology terms, becomes the land of 7 nations, because this is what pops up in Revelation later on. And it tells us that a nation is a head, so a head is a symbol of a nation. So this is why we read that the beast in the dragon in Revelation 12 has 7 heads with crowns on them. It's the time that someone is controlling the entire kingdom of Israel. We'll look at that later. So when Herod died, the kingdom was split up between his 3 sons. Herod Archelaus got half of it, the orange bit. Philip and Herod Antipas got the remaining. They got a quarter each, but none of them had the power that Herod the Great had. Herod was legendary in his building projects, including the temple, and even the disciples said to Jesus, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings." And everything about Herod was in contrast to Jesus. They were both called King of the Jews by the Romans, but Herod was proud and worshipped himself, whereas Jesus was humble and worshipped God. Herod was the king of the Jews appointed by Rome. Jesus was the king of the Jews appointed by God. Herod built a temple of hewn stones. Jesus built a better temple. Herod received a crown at 33. Jesus received a crown of thorns at 33. Herod killed his bride in anger. Jesus died for his bride in love. Herod's temple said, "No foreigner to pass into the court of the Jews." Jesus said, "My house will be called a house of prayer for all nations." So you can see this dramatic contrast. It's really one pitted against the other. And there's one more comparison I'd like to make. And this sheds light on the way that Jesus was mocked at his death. So Herod had been the king of the Jews, and the sign of the cross at the cross that was on Jesus, of course, was king of the Jews. But the Romans were mocking him by what Herod had done in his death. Josephus tells us how Herod he'd specifically said before he died how he wanted to be adorned for his death. He said his body would be conveyed to Herodium, which was the amazing palace he'd made for himself, where, in accordance with the directions of the deceased, it was to be interred. The late king was covered in purple, with a diadem put on his head and a crown of gold above it, and a scepter in his right hand. This was all at the command of Herod. So the Romans mocked Jesus by copying what the last king of the Jews had done. They put on him a purple robe and a crown of thorns on his head and a staff in his right hand. And for sure they would have remembered the pomp that of Herod the Great, who had insisted on all these things. So that's a simple introduction to Herod, but he pops up again in Daniel and Revelation, which I find even more interesting. So let's go to Revelation, where he becomes both a symbol and a sign, where we read, "Another sign appeared in heaven, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on his head. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth, so that it might devour her child the moment he was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all nations with a rod of iron." So this is obviously Herod the evil dragon, because he was the one who wanted to kill the baby of Mary as soon as he was born. And he has 7 crowns on his 7 heads, because this is the time of him ruling the entire land of Israel, the land of 7 nations, which are heads. So for instance, when we read of 10 crowns on 10 horns, that's a different time period. That's the days of, at the end of time, the 10 crowned horns that are the enemies of Israel. So this is like depicting a time period when the crowns are. So Mary is the other great sign. She's called a great sign, clothed with all the lights of heaven, and she's the arch rival of Herod. They're symbols of light and darkness. And Mary shone in a world that was dark. We're told in verse 9, "The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil and Satan." So this is identifying Herod the Great with the devil and Satan. It's a flashback to Eden, that ancient serpent, it says. And it's confronting a woman again. Only this time, the woman isn't taken in by the lies of the serpent. Let's read it. "When the dragon saw that he'd been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. The dragon was enraged at the woman and went to make war with the rest of her seed, who keep the commandments of God." So obviously this woman is Mary, and it's saying she kept the commandments of God. Whereas back in Eden, Eve made the mistake of being deceived by the serpent, and she didn't keep the commandments of God. So here we've got a symbol of the second Eve, who is Mary, who keeps the commandments of God. She gets it right. And I don't think we give enough credit to this symbol of Mary. I think we're a bit afraid of Mariology, that we might over-esteem her or something, but she's a really powerful symbol, not just here, but in so many other places. When you look beneath the surface, she's the certain one Jesus invited to the Last Supper. She's another beloved disciple at the tomb who saw the bandages unrolled and believed. Like she's the cherub, a symbol on the ark, the second Adam, the second Eve, who keep the commandments. And like there's so many ways that we overlook Mary in the symbols that she brings. Okay, so the story goes on. It's not just talking about Herod and Mary, it's talking about the seed of both of them. So the seed of Herod, the seed of the serpent, was the scribes, Pharisees, Herodians that, excuse me, they're called you offspring of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come. And again in Luke 3, offspring of vipers, it's another way of saying seed of the serpent. Do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. And of course, in contrast is this are the seed of the woman, the rest of her children who keep the commands. They are the Christians. So this great contrast continues down history. So the details of this prophecy in Revelation 12 describe Herod perfectly. A huge red dragon or serpent with 7 crowns, because he ruled all the land of Israel. And we're told that he, this dragon, lost his place in heaven and was cast down to the earth. And this is talking about the Jews losing their place as the custodians of God's word. The gospel then goes out via the Christians, and the Jews are scattered from the land. And Herod is similar to the serpent in Eden again, because the serpent in Eden was also cast to the earth and had to slither on the dust, in the dust on his belly. So I believe that, like, this is also a second application of Eden, and I think that what happened in Eden was about as literal as what we're reading in Revelation here. They're both symbols. So that's a glimpse of Herod in Revelation. So let's look at now what Daniel has to say about Herod. Right. So it's a bit of a tricky chapter. He pops up in Daniel 11. And so I'm going to read the traditional view of Daniel 11 from Wiki. It says, Daniel 11 addresses the defilement of the altar in Jerusalem in 167 BC, but whereas the events leading up to the sacking of the temple in 167 are remarkably accurate, the predicted war between the Syrians, which is the king of the north, and the Egyptians, king of the south, never took place. So they're saying, basically, they just don't understand the end of Daniel 11, so they say it's not accurate. John Thomas said that, you know, the Abomination of Desolation is one of the key things in Daniel 11, and John Thomas equated that with the statue of Jupiter set up by Antiochus Epiphanes, and he put a different time period on the final king of the north and king of the south, and said they were Russia, and in the north and the south was Tarshish, a Briton who occupied Egypt at the time he lived. And another interpretation, which sort of is a bit of a red rag to a bull to me, which is sad, but I mean, I really like Rob Hindman, but he sadly left believing in God. And so he put up what he thinks about Daniel 11. He said, despite describing the kings up to Antiochus Epiphanes accurately and describing the early part of the reign of Antiochus Epiphanes, the prophecy fails to mention the most significant events of his reign, namely the recapture of Jerusalem by the Maccabees. And that's wrong, because it is there, I'll show you. And the rededication of the temple. The great prophecies of Daniel are only impressive evidence for the inspiration of the Bible if they were written before the events they describe, and that seems extremely unlikely. The book is accurate about recent history between 300 to 165 BC, muddled about earlier history, the Babylonian and Persian periods. He's wrong about that too, and completely wrong about what would happen next, the Maccabean revolt. This is what you would expect from something written by a human being. It's not what you would expect if God had anything to do with it. So he's saying, basically, he doesn't understand it. So he's saying it's not written by God or inspired. So that's part of my motivation to say that we can understand it and we can explain it, to show it's not a failed prophecy. And the abomination of desolation is not a pig or on the altar or a statue of Jupiter. It's the abomination of desolation of the Jews who got everything wrong and ended up killing their Messiah. That is the abomination of desolation that God cared about. It's to correct all these people that say you can't understand it and they have silly interpretations. And what's really exciting, it ends with Herod the Great and the pattern, and it goes on. The prophecy continues into chapter 12. The dead are raised. It's the coming of the kingdom, and it follows the exact pattern as all of Daniel's other prophecies and the prophecies of the seals, trumpets, and bowls that we find in Revelation. And so they're all consistent. And to me, that's like just another really reassuring tick that, wow, this is really inspired. So what I'm going to do is actually read the whole chapter and give my little comments about what it's talking about to show that it can make sense, and it does make sense, and yeah, it's accurate. So I'll just keep an eye on the time. It's a long chapter. Right. Where are we? Oh, sorry, I'll read it off this screen. I threw away the wrong page. Also, in the first year of Darius the Mede, who was contemporary with Cyrus, I stood up to confirm and strengthen him. And now I will show you the truth. Behold, 3 more kings after Cyrus shall arise in Persia. They were Cambyses, Bardia, and Darius the first. And a 4th shall be far richer than all of them. That's talking about Xerxes the first. And when he has become strong through his riches, he shall stir up all against the kingdom of Greece, which is what he did. I think it was in 480 BC, and he raised the largest army, and with ships, the largest ancient army ever assembled. So that's all simple and accurate. Everyone agrees with that. Then a mighty king shall arise, who will rule with great dominion and do according to his will. This is Alexander the Great now. And when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken and divided toward the 4 winds of heaven, but not to his posterity, nor according to the dominion with which he ruled. For his kingdom will be plucked up and go to others beside these. And we all know that when Herod died, his kingdom was split between his generals and Alexander. And so the king of the south is the Ptolemies, the Greek Ptolemies in Egypt, and the king of the north is the Seleucids up in the area of Syria. Then the king of the south, which is Egypt, ruled by the Greek Ptolemies, shall be strong, but one of their princes shall be stronger than he, which is Seleucus in the area of Syria. And his dominion shall be a great dominion. After some years they shall make an alliance, and the daughter of the king of the south, who is Berenice, shall come to the king of the north to make peace. She married Antiochus II of the Syria area. But she shall not retain the strength of her arm, and he and his offspring shall not endure, but she shall be given up, and her attendants, her child, and he who got possession of her. And this is all in history. So Antiochus sent her away with their son, and he went back to his first wife, who poisoned him, which is basically what's being said in Daniel 11. In those times, a branch from her roots, which is Ptolemy III, shall arise in his place. He shall come against the army and enter the fortress of the king of the north, which is Seleucus Callinicus, and he shall deal with them and shall prevail. His sons of the north shall wage war and assemble a multitude of great forces, which shall come on and overflow and pass through, and again shall carry the war as far as his fortress. Then the king of the south, moved with anger, shall come out and fight with the king of the north, and shall raise a great multitude, but it shall be given into his hand. And when the multitude is taken, his heart shall be exalted, and he shall cast down tens of thousands, but he shall not prevail, for the king of the north shall raise a multitude greater than the former, and after some years he shall come on with a great army and abundant supplies. In those times many shall rise against the king of the south. So this is describing the ongoing Syrian wars between, the Ptolemies in the south and the Seleucids in the north. In those times, meaning the ones just described, it's during the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC. And this ends this little section. And the subject then moves to Israel. Oops. And in those times, the men of violence, or the pestilent ones among your own people, shall lift themselves up to establish the vision, and they have stumbled. So this is actually the Maccabee rebellion. And of course, the Jews wouldn't interpret it this way, because they glorify this getting their kingdom back, and that this is what Hanukkah was about. But we've got to remember, God said through Huldah the prophetess that he was going to overturn, and there would be no kings or priests until he comes whose right it is. But this is the Jews setting up kings and priests again. But this verse is saying they're the rebellious, pestilent, violent ones, and they actually don't have the blessing of God. This is where they fit into this time prophecy. So they had an independent Jewish kingdom that lasted 77 years. And right. So, but then when they got their independence, that's when Pompey of Rome came through, and he conquered the Seleucid kingdom to the north. So if we keep reading, and the king of the north, so it changes, like the king of the north and the king of the south move with time. It's not always the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. So the king of the north, which is now Rome, shall not, hang on, lost my place. And the king, I'll just read this. So, and the king of the north, now the Romans led by Pompey, shall come and throw up siege works and take strong cities. So he had a 4-year campaign, and he used those typical Roman siege works. And he captured Jerusalem and lots of other cities for the Romans. Oh, there we are. There's a picture. And the forces of the south, which is still Ptolemaic Egypt, shall not stand, or even his picked troops, for there shall be no strength to stand. And by this time, Egypt was involved in its own civil war between Cleopatra and her brother. They were fighting for sole rulership. But he who comes against him, meaning he who comes against Pompey, who's Julius Caesar, shall do according to his own will, and none shall stand before him, and he shall stand in the glorious land, and all of it shall be in his power. So Julius Caesar and Pompey became rivals. It says, he shall set his face to come with the strength of his whole kingdom and bring terms of peace and perform them. And he, Julius Caesar, shall give him the daughter of women, corrupting her, but his plan will not succeed or help him. This seems a bit of a flashback. Julius Caesar gave his daughter to Pompey in marriage, but she actually died in childbirth. And after that, their relationship declined and they became mortal enemies. And actually, Julius Caesar chased Pompey down to Egypt, and that's where he died. And then it says, afterwards he, meaning Julius Caesar, shall turn his face to the coastlands and take many of them. This is what Julius Caesar did. He captured Gaul, which is the old word for France, Africa, Hispania, the old word for Portugal and Spain, and even Britain. It was Julius Caesar who took 800 ships to Britain and took a lot of that. But a commander shall put an end to his insolence. Indeed, he shall turn his insolence back on him. He shall turn his face back toward the fortresses of his own land. And after Julius Caesar had done all that conquering, he returned to Rome, where he met his downfall. We all know the story. He was stabbed to death by his own Senate. And it says he'll fall to be seen no more in the fortresses of his own land. And see how perfectly this is all fitting when you just like apply a different time frame to it. Then shall arise in his place one who shall send an exactor of tribute. And when Julius Caesar died, Cassius was the one who ruled over Israel, and he appointed Antipater, was Herod the Great's father, as a tax collector for Rome. And then it says, but within a few days he shall be broken, neither in anger nor in battle. And Antipater had been sort of ruling on behalf of Rome for a long time, but once he was appointed by Cassius to this elevated level, another fellow Jew got jealous and wanted his job and poisoned him. So it wasn't in battle or anger, it was just what you do when you want someone else's job. Okay, and now that's Herod the Great's father off the scene, and we start reading about Herod the Great, who is he's the center point of the end of Daniel 11 and brings us to the days of Christ. Okay, it says, in his place, in Antipater's place, a despicable person will arise. So Herod replaced his father Antipater, and they have not put on him the honor of the kingdom, but he will come in a time of peace and seize the kingdom by intrigue, which is what Herod did. He gained the kingdom by going to Rome and saying he needed their help and he would take it, and he'd be on Rome's side if they were on his side. And he took Jerusalem with Rome's help by getting on side with the Pharisees, and they sort of at the time of the attack, they double-crossed their own people. So then verse 22, then a flood of forces will be swept away before him and destroyed along with the prince of the covenant. So Herod captured Jerusalem with the Romans and killed Antigonus, the prince. He was the one the Parthian Magi had appointed. So he was a Jew, and they appointed him as king and high priest. And so Herod had him killed. And from the time that an alliance is made with him, he shall act deceitfully and become strong with a small people. So this would be his alliance. Yeah, I think this is talking about the alliance Herod made with Octavian and becoming strong with the small people who were the Pharisees. So in a time of peace, he will invade the richest provinces and do what his fathers and forefathers never did. He will lavish plunder, loot, and wealth on his followers, and he will plot against the strongholds, but only for a time. So Herod was notorious for winning people over with bribes and paying them off. And the two kings, the ones who just made an alliance, Herod and Octavian, will speak lies at the same table, but to no avail, for still the end will come at the appointed time. And he will return to his land with great wealth, but his heart will be set against the Holy Covenant, and so he will do damage and return to his own land. So this is where Herod pledged his allegiance to Octavian, who gave him back the cities that Cleopatra had taken off him, as well as 400 bodyguards and a whole lot of presents. So then at the time appointed, he shall turn toward the south. The time appointed, I think, for the birth of Jesus. And the latter coming, I think this means of the Magi, shall not be as the first. I mean, a lot of this is sort of disjointed, and you have to know the whole story before you can fit it together. It says, they, meaning in the Septuagint, they, the Magi, shall come forth and journey out, and he, Herod, shall be grieved. Then he will turn back and vent his fury against the Holy Covenant and have intelligence with them that have forsaken the Holy Covenant, which I think is talking about Herod speaking to the Jews about where the Christ would be born. Like this is really giving a broad overview of key points. And I've given two versions here, the Masoretic and the Septuagint. The Masoretic says, forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress and shall depart from the continual. It doesn't say sacrifice, it just says continual. And they shall set up the abomination of desolation. And the Septuagint says, seeds shall spring up out of him, meaning out of Herod, and they shall profane the sanctuary of strength, and they shall depart from the perpetual and make the abomination desolate. So this is sort of jumping to the future a bit, saying the seeds that come out of Herod, which was the Pharisees and the rulers who killed Jesus, they profane the sanctuary of strength, which is Jesus, by killing him. And that is how they said that is the abomination of desolation. That makes far more sense to me than saying that it's the Jewish leaders who are corrupt and desolate, than saying it's talking about a Greek offering a pig on a temple or whatever. So the darkness of the Jewish rulers. Oh, yeah, that's just what I said. And they, the Jewish leaders who are the seed of Herod, shall depart from the perpetual, and I think we could put covenant rather than sacrifice, and establish the abomination of desolation. And we know that Israel departed from the perpetual covenant. We're told in Jeremiah 30, they will ask the way to Zion and turn their faces toward it. They will come and bind themselves to the Lord in a perpetual covenant that will not be forgotten, implying that the one they had was forgotten. So I think that's what it's talking about. And we know that Jesus said that the house of Israel was an abomination. Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those sent to her, your house is left to you desolate. You will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So that's what I think the meaning of the Abomination of Desolation is in that particular context. There are several desolations, but that's what this one is talking about. And then the text goes back, as it often does in Daniel. It skips back and it tells you sort of more detail of the same thing. And now it's giving us, this really tells you it's Herod the Great it's talking about. He, Herod, shall seduce with flattery those who violate the covenant, but the people who know their God shall stand firm and take action. And those among the people who are wise shall make many understand, those they shall fall by sword and flame and captivity for some days. And when they fall, they'll receive a little help, and many shall join themselves with flattery. And some of those who are wise will fall to refine themselves and cleanse them and make them white until the time of the end, for it is yet for a time appointed. So the phrase until the end of the time, where was that? Until the end of the time, I think it's talking about everything goes back to the time periods of Daniel's 70-week prophecy. And I think it's talking about the end of the 62 sevens, which is when Jesus appeared. And he got up and said, the time is fulfilled, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, which was meant to begin a 7-year Jubilee period, but he got killed in the middle of it. So it got deferred. So, and then the text gives us more detail of Herod. And the king, Herod, will do according to his will. He'll exalt himself, magnify himself above every god and over the God of gods, and he will speak pompous words and will prosper until the wrath shall be completed. He'll show no regard for the gods of his ancestors or the ones desired by women, nor will he regard any god, but exalt himself above all. He shall honor the God of fortresses, which is exactly what Herod did. He was legendary for his building projects. A God whom his fathers did not know, he'll honor with gold and silver, precious stones, and he'll make people rulers and divide the land. So at this time in history, and the remaining verses, the key players are Herod the Great, Octavian, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra. At the time of the end, he, Herod, shall mix horns or combine forces with the king of the south, which was his allegiance first with Mark Antony, and the king of the north shall rush upon him, meaning the king of the south, like a whirlwind with chariots and horsemen and many ships. And this is exactly what happened at the Battle of Actium between Antony and Cleopatra, the south, with Herod in the north. And that's actually a picture from Herod's palace depicting the Battle of Actium, which is fascinating. And he, Octavian, will come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. He, the king of the north, Octavian, shall come into the glorious land, escorted by Herod, who by now has teamed up with him. And many shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand, Edom, Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites, which is, as you can see on the map, exactly what happened. They didn't get captured by Octavian. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. So that's just a map of the path Octavian took, capturing that whole land. And where am I? I have to rush through this. There's so much here. He, Octavian, shall become ruler of the precious things of Egypt. Okay, this never happened to anyone else after this. Like, Octavian became the richest man that ever lived in all history, except for possibly the fabled king of Timbuktu. He was enormous. All the wealth of Egypt went to Octavian, and you just can't apply this prophecy to anyone else. he really celebrated. That coin there says Egypt is captured, and he had huge festivities in Rome. Like, this was such a grand big thing for the Romans to capture all the wealth of Egypt and have it under their control from then on for a long time. So then we go back to the text about Herod, because he's the main focus. So that was just a lot of an incidental thing. Tidings from the east and north shall alarm him, and he shall go forth with great fury to exterminate and utterly destroy many. So that's the tidings from the east were the Magi. He felt threatened by his kingship, and the north, soon after that, his two sons by Mariamne, the wife he murdered, were plotting to kill him, and no wonder, because he'd murdered their mother. And so it put him into this killing frenzy. Like, things were really piling up on him around this time. And he shall pitch the tabernacles of his palaces between the seas in the glorious holy mountain. So, I mean, just look at that map. This is what Herod did. No one else was like Herod in popping up palaces all between the Sea of Galilee, the Dead Sea, and the Mediterranean Sea. That describes Herod perfectly. So then the prophecy doesn't end there. The chapter ends there. The prophecy says, and in that time, Michael, the great prince who stands watch over your people, will arise. There'll be a time of trouble, of distress, the likes of which have not occurred from the beginning of nations until that time. And what was the greatest trouble for Israel? When they rejected their Messiah and they were scattered for 2,000 years, culminating in the Holocaust. And they lost their place in heaven. That is a time of trouble. And it's still going on. They're empowered witnesses at the moment, but the time of their witness, when it finishes, the beast that rises from the abyss is going to trample on them again. So it's ongoing. And at that time, your people, everyone whose name is found written in the book, will be delivered. So this is the resurrection. Many who sleep in the dust will awake, some to everlasting life, some to shame and everlasting contempt. So we go from this incredibly detailed prophecy that people like Rob Heinemann and the scholars on Wiki say it was written after the events because it's too detailed and it's only accurate up to the time of Antiochus. So we go from that detailed prophecy in chapter 11 to this really vague one that ends with the kingdom in chapter 12. But what's exciting is it follows exactly the same pattern as all the other prophecies in Daniel and in Revelation with the seals, trumpets, and bowls. They follow the same pattern, and they're all talking about Israel. So we have this like metal man, and we've got the times of the Babylonians, Greeks, Medes, Persians, the Romans, and we've got a gap while they're scattered, while the Jews, it's their time of trouble such as never was, and it kicks up again the days of the 10 toes, which is the 10 crowned horns on the beast on all the beasts. The beast pops up in Daniel and Revelation with 10 crowned horns, the end times. So we've got the same thing happening in Daniel 7 with the beasts down to the time of the Romans, and then the Jews are scattered, and then this end time 10 crowned horned period, which is right now. And then in Revelation 11, we've got the same, it follows the same pattern. And so that is the pattern that we read of in Daniel 11 and Daniel 12. It's following the same thing. And to find out about that gap period and about the end time period more fully, you go to Revelation, because it's all following Daniel's 70 weeks prophecy. So when it says at the time of the end, there's a cursor here, laser pointer. The time of the end for Herod the Great was the end of the 62 sevens. And then Jesus came and said, the time is fulfilled. The kingdom of heaven is at hand. That was meant to be the final 7 of the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel 9. It was meant to be the start of a 7-year Jubilee period. That's why Jesus, first thing he read in the temple, the Spirit is the Lord is upon me. I've come to set the captives. It's proclaiming a Jubilee. But he was killed in the middle of the last 7 of this prophecy. So that's why the last 3.5 years is what Revelation is talking about, a representative time described as 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years, or 42 months, 3.5 years. And yeah, so we can go to Revelation and understand the